So I'm going to try to follow that up a little bit quickly before lunch. And what I want you to think about is many of the things that Rishi and Sapna were talking about, but I want you to think about it in a slightly different dimension. I want you to think about now adding on a fourth dimension that looks at the provider and the trainee and how that might look or how we might think about that. And these are my disclosures. I do need to say that the thoughts and opinions that I'm giving you are not representative of the Society of Critical Care Medicine, but are mine today, so don't interpret them. And what I want you to do is to just sort of take a moment to either close your eyes or think deeply and think sort of 10 years in the future as you're coming into the ICU. So you're driving your autonomous vehicle in, or you're riding in it, and you're coming into the parking lot. And as you come into that, sort of into the Wi-Fi of your hospital, it's surveilling by eye tracking as you're coming in, your fatigability, your distractibility. It's identifying you and linking you with the patients that you're going to see today that are on your service, the providers who are on your team. And as you're walking in from, say, the garage to your office to do your pre-rounding or whatever, it's measuring your gait, your stability, how many times I trip on the way to the office or get confused. It's feeding that in, and it's starting to measure my heart rate variability, putting in my anxiety, etc. It's looking at my sleep patterns, and as I approach the ICU, instead of me swiping my badge to get in, it recognizes me from the RFID chip in my badge, and it projects in to get into the ICU. It won't open the doors unless I answer a question. That question is related to the patient who's the sickest patient in my unit who has impending respiratory failure and needs to be intubated. And it asks me something about propofol or ketamine or one of the drugs that I'm likely to use based on the pattern that I have usually used for such a patient. And I need to answer that. When I answer that, right or wrong, it gives me the correct answer, et cetera, just like the maintenance of certification on the boards. And it will open the door for me, but at the same time, it's reporting and recording this, sending it to the Academy of Pediatrics so that it can be put in. I don't need to log in and do my thing for mock, but it's essentially feeding into my certification. It's also identifying the team members. And so on the way to the unit, I'm doing a quick sort of dexterity check, which again is self-reporting my wellness, my readiness to perform, as well as the team members who have all logged in on the way into the unit at the same day. It now can project for me as I'm moving towards the hologram that's outside of the patient's room that is sort of projecting the hemodynamic status, et cetera, and providing the decision support that might be needed for selecting the medications, the tubes, the lines, et cetera, that might be needed. And as I move forward, it is identifying with Akira's Near for Kids detection pattern that the intubator and the people that I've selected to do the procedure are not on their QSUM score, have not been performing well recently, and so that I need to switch from the resident to the fellow as the first intubator. And at the same time, it's surveilling the staffing of the unit, as Jerry was pointing out, to see which of the nurses should be participating, and looking into the OR to see which of the rescue anesthesiologists are available should we fail in this difficult airway patient. So as we come forward, it's tracking and reporting not only the past performance, but predicting the needs of the patient and also the needs of the providers. So as we move forward, let's think a little bit about the complex system that we perform in, and also how the work system, the processes, and the outcomes are currently being measured and what we need to add to this. And what I would propose to you is that in the future, we won't just be measuring the patient's mobility, the patient's, but we also will be layering on another dimension that will actually be surveilling and continuously updating the provider profiles to this. And as we add that to the learning healthcare system, the evaluation of outcomes, we would be linking real events and simulated events, so that rather than sort of relying on self-reported data, we would actually be measuring what we do, adding it back, and adding it to the system that we use. We know that our care for the patients depends on medical science, education, efficiency, and local implementation. And we know that there are many factors that we currently measure and a lot that we don't measure that actually impact the outcomes that we desire. But what we really need to focus on really is this knowledge processing, teach, learn, remember, act, and act well that Jerry was talking about, and how those factors are also included in the care of our patients and the outcomes that we want. In the American Heart Association, with cardiac arrest, there's been a lot of attention starting to be paid to the current existing practices in the educational efficiency, looking at deliberate practice-based learning, booster training, teamwork and leadership training, and the in situ situational awareness that can be recorded, quantified, and added to the matrix that leads to improved survival. But as many have pointed out, we have a lot of measurements that are happening at the bedside, but they are not well integrated. And what's missing in this picture is obviously the provider and the family. And so when we think about the learning healthcare system, most of it has focused on the patient and not the provider and the education. And when we think about the enabling conditions that are at our fingertips, the engagement of the clinicians, the parents, the family, and that we have, every one of us in our hospitals already has a learning management system that captures the checkbox of the mandatories, the training, the life support training, et cetera, but it is totally divorced from the care. And so what I'm suggesting is that in the future, we really need to not only have registries, real-world data, real-world evidence, clinical decision-making, and patient-reported outcomes that are tracked and in the VPS system, but indeed we need to do that for simulated events and training, that we need to have a mirror image that's captured and incorporated so that we can have this, and we can also link it to the continuous evaluation and certification. And we can do that at several levels. I think in the present, we measure and checkbox on minimal competence. Whereas with this type of system, the possibilities are that we can look at excellence and really outstanding performance. And we can look at not only what doesn't work, but we can also look at what does work and why. And so the principles that we're talking about of personalizing our approach fits in concept, but we are not measuring the right things to be able to move forward. So that's where we come in. How do we measure communication? I'm going to tell you that here and now, in Copenhagen, we've developed a system for the telephone dispatchers when they answer the call for a 911 call. In the background, there is automated voice recognition that is faster than the dispatchers at recognizing cardiac arrest and distress of the rescuer. And so they can titrate, it's 17 seconds faster than the medic in dispatching the ambulance to the scene based on detecting a problem. We also don't know how many we need to train, how much training is necessary, how often, et cetera. And I think we can learn a lot from our ID friends about herd immunity. What's an appropriate coverage pattern? Who needs to be present and available? Does every single person need to be trained to this extent or not? And so when we think about personalization of training, it should not just be at the individual level, which is easier to measure, but it probably needs to be at the system level. And so some of the systems that we've been talking about this morning would have the capability of not only capturing the individual performance measure, but also the metric, like Jerry was talking about, what's happening to the patient next door, the provider next door, et cetera. How do we put that configuration together to better train the environment in order to be able to cope with the emergencies that are going to occur? As I said, we focus on minimal competency. We like mastery performance. And what is consistent now is, I think, the move away from time-based learning to competence-based learning, and the idea of booster effect or low-dose, high-frequency training at the time when the provider is ready to learn or needs to learn, matching the patient behind the door with the education that I get so that I'm much more interested and much more available to actually capture and use the data that I'm being trained on. This type of process for CPR is now being codified and moved into the environment with roving mobile carts that are available for just-in-time training for CPR and PALS, for instance. But when we think about other things with training and support, we think about our diverse patient population, and now we have cognitive aids, usually little pocket cards or apps, etc., that are present. And as Rishi was talking about, trying to make that very available and apparent, just in time, just in place for the sharp end provider in a format that is really much more attuned to giving us that little piece of information we need at the right time and the right place, rather than trying to sift through a complex card in tiny print at a time when we're at our largest, largest point of need. The move in the future, I think, is going to be towards acquiring information, voice, video, RFID chip movement around the bedside, some of the things that Sapna was talking about, into resuscitation bays of the future, where the use of eye tracking, where the use of live capture, the use of the movement around the bedside can be used for real-time coaching and feedback. So that at the point of care, just like in big sports, where they can analyze and predict what they need to do next, the same thing is true for training in the ICU. Why not? It's here and now, it's possible, and as we move towards a more cloud-based environment, the potential to do this and to coach remotely is clearly available. So I think in the next 10 years, this will move forward. And it will really focus on the individual, the team, and the systems using existing types of approaches of low-dose, high-frequency training, as well as performance feedback, reflection, and debriefing. But it will incorporate, as we think forward, real-time measurement of the parameters of the provider. We will probably use biometrics. We will be able to monitor things that we can currently monitor and measure in the sports world, and we can add to it. This is an example of near-infrared spectroscopy headbands that are measuring the blood flow to the frontal lobe, to the temporal lobe, to the occipital lobe, to identify for the team leader and the charge nurse what their cognitive load is and how that correlates with their brain blood flow, and can we start to measure some of these activities in simulation and in real life that relate to performance. And can we then project on a dashboard, either an individual dashboard or a group dashboard, how ready we are to perform these types of procedures? It's really about human factors, and it's not just in the first world. We can actually do this quite well outside of the intensive first world environment. So as we think about what gets lost in translation, it's mostly what we teach, learn, and remember, and what we do that we're not measuring in order to improve outcomes, but that with a little work and perhaps some thought by this group, we'll be able to incorporate some of the main parameters that will decrease that loss in translation and improve patient outcomes. There's a very nice summary of the existing infrastructure and landscape of training in this British medical journal that summarizes the current level of sort of training approaches, but these are taken sort of on steroids by our sports friends in Real Madrid and the Ferrari Driving Learning Center, where they're really using these at the next level for training. Obviously, people are worried about privacy, cybersecurity. We don't want to be measured. We don't want people to know what our knowledge level is, what our behaviors are, how we perform. And so really figuring out how to make our providers comfortable with the amount of information that we're going to have and use in order to deliver better care, I think is something that we really have to talk about in this group, and how we're going to address that. COVID has taught us a lot about how people are willing to change the way they train, the way they perform, and what is measured. And we're not going to get rid of peer training. This is how, see one, do one, learn one, but that process doesn't count, right? Right now, if you coach somebody, if you train somebody, it's lost into the ether. If you give a lecture like this, right, you can put it on your CV, you can go ahead and report it, and your promotions committee counts it as education. Whereas that's where the education is occurring, but that is lost to the world. Nobody ever measures that, you don't report that, and you don't get credit for that for your promotion. We need to figure out how to do that. How do we look at and anticipate the new areas? Everybody here is building new areas at their hospitals and changing and moving, et cetera. How do we explore and use these techniques in order to identify latent safety errors before they occur? And of course, it would be remiss to sort of not acknowledge that here and now, we're much more using virtual reality training. But in the future, I think it's going to be that real patient video, that real patient that gets embedded in the virtual reality about how we're going to practice and just-in-time train to take care of that patient. We already have a SimBox. The American College of Emergency Physicians has a standalone remote training module that's free online, open FOAMed, that can be used to train on simple scenarios. And social media is increasingly being utilized in order to confirm appropriate interventions and to record and collect anecdotes of care. Gamification will likely increase and is very much moving forward. So how we can use what the gaming industry currently uses to identify how people learn, what tracks they're going down, competing with each other, linking outside, needs to be incorporated into it, and we can capture data from that that can tell us a lot about people's learning preferences, how they choose, what they want, and when they need it. And of course, gathering into leagues, teamwork, and figuring out how to take that, instead of talking about football players and their profiles, perhaps it's patients and their profiles that we'd be able to substitute and use this type of technology for. So as we think about the quality and the safety of our systems, it's really not, we should not forget about education as we move forward with the VPS and the potential to both intervene and measure the important outcomes. But we should think about some of these elements that we'll talk about in the small groups, I think, about how we can better capture those elements and incorporate them into the care of our patients, and also into our learning management system and into our certification processes. And last but not least, we shouldn't think that mentoring, training, peer support is not important. We should develop some metrics. We should develop some ways to capture these types of more ethereal kinds of interventions. So one size doesn't fit all. High quality, not minimal competence. Low dose, high frequency training is here to stay. Just in time, find the teachable moment. Live capture and audit in many forms, audio, video, etc., are important. A highly practiced team, the ability to coach either on site or remotely, developing these clinical collaboratories, and an individualized and personalized approach, not just to the individual, but to the team and to the environment. And finally, that the movement towards human factors and wearables is here to stay and likely will be amplified over the next 10 years. But the final message, as Jerry, I think, mentioned, is if we don't measure it, we can't change it. And that's, I think, what everybody here would agree with. Thank you.